What the Urban Challenge Fund does is, or we hope that it will do, because it has not yet been as such formulated and announced. What we hope that the Urban Challenge Fund will do is to take the overall challenge of redeveloping our cities and keep the option open to the city to propose what kind of project it needs to do. I'm particularly excited by this also because it builds on the experience that we have gained over the implementation of the Smart Cities mission, which was also held in a challenge mode, where money was provided to different cities based on different sets of projects proposed by the cities and on the basis of consultation with all stakeholders at the local level. That challenge led to the identification of 100 cities and a whole portfolio of projects. Some over 8,000 projects have now become close to implementation completion. Actually, leadership as well as dependability as a corporate entity, both of these are joined at the hip. If you don't have the right leadership, then the investor will not feel confident of investing in that city or in that particular project. So I would see this as essentially, one problem, which is that we need to take care of the kinds of leadership that we need at city level. Now, one could do it, in a sort of executive order and say, well, all municipal commissioners must be fully in power or, and in charge of deciding on all aspects of urban infrastructure, which in principle they are, but they are not practically actually taking those decisions. Many of those decisions are taken at the state government level. So one could try and do that through an executive order, but that's not going to fix one of our key problems, which is that the municipal acts in the different states of the country, those municipal acts don't give the same kind of leadership model. What Swachh Bharat Mission did was to create the awareness and also to create some level of local ownership for the solutions to the problem, right? And I think that's fundamental. Having said that, it's very unlikely that most citizens are aware about all of the problems that cities and city governments have to deal with, from transportation to water, sanitation, energy management to crowd management to housing, land use, all of these. This is very, very complex. So if Swachh Bharat is an example of behavior change at a societal scale, then we need that kind of behavior change at societal scale to be relevant for all of the different complex aspects of cities.
Hello and welcome to Jagan Shah, the Infravision Foundation CEO, and also a really well-regarded urban planner and architect. He's had a lot of input in the Smart Cities mission as well. So he's, I think, perfectly placed to talk to us about the Urban Challenge Fund and why he thinks it's such a game changer. Jagan Shah, welcome to the show. And why do you think the Urban Challenge Fund is going to make a huge difference, if implemented right, to the way we plan and imagine our cities?
Thanks, Kaveri. Thanks for setting up this conversation. It's a really important subject and very well chosen. Thank you. I think the Urban Challenge Fund is a major shift, because till now what we have seen is public programs where the funds are provided for specific purposes, which are predefined. Say, for instance, Swachh Bharat Mission pays for building toilets or reinforcing solid waste management, installation of technologies, and so on. Likewise, the Amrut program, which is also a 50,000 crore scheme with the central contribution of 50,000 crores, that program also looked at water supply and sanitation. and a few other elements of urban infrastructure. What the Urban Challenge Fund does is, or we hope that it will do, because it has not yet been as such formulated and announced. What we hope that the Urban Challenge Fund will do is to take the overall challenge of redeveloping our cities and keep the option open to the city to propose what kind of project it needs to do. I'm particularly excited by this also because it builds on the experience that we have gained over the implementation of the Smart Cities mission, which was also held in a challenge mode, where money was provided to different cities based on different sets of projects proposed by the cities and on the basis of consultation with all stakeholders at the local level. That challenge led to the identification of 100 cities and a whole portfolio of projects. Some over 8,000 projects have now become close to implementation completion. Now, that scheme has given us a lot of insight into what works and what doesn't work. And I think the Urban Challenge Fund can build on that experience. What is important is that it comes at a time when the government has recognized that urbanization is going to be a key driver of the Indian economy. However, urbanization currently is largely unplanned and therefore imposes the burden of a lot of constraints on future growth for the cities. Unplanned urbanization is a big problem, and the Urban Challenge Fund will give us an opportunity to address that problem. What we will also be able to do is to look at the larger regional footprint of cities. Hopefully, we will see a scheme that addresses the big problem of differences between municipal boundaries, peri-urban areas, and unplanned rural areas, which are attached to cities. All of this will be a possibility if the scheme is designed right.
That's the key, isn't it, Jagan? If the scheme is designed right. So what are we hearing about the way it's being designed and the way it will be implemented?
I can't say for sure because we are not privy to any conversations within government. But as you would have seen, our founder Vinayak Chatterjee has written an op-ed article on which we have all been doing a lot of discussion. And what seems to be the important aspects of the design of the scheme is what I've already said, number one, which is that it shouldn't be allocative in nature. It shouldn't define in advance what the projects ought to be. However, what it ought to do is to certainly have a kind of negative list. It should not fund flyovers. It should not fund that kind of infrastructure, which we know to be largely unsuccessful in meeting the problems of road transportation. So it can have a negative list. It can proscribe certain kinds of projects. And actually, by doing that, it will also give a very strong policy signal. So, for instance, the scheme can particularly attract housing projects, which I think are really important because it's high time that Indian cities provided housing for everybody. Then it can certainly give preference to circularity projects where we are doing recycling of solid waste, liquid waste, electronic waste, those kinds of projects. Also, it can give a high preference for projects which are integrated across multiple domains. So, for instance, take a road in any kind of Indian city. That road only is not only used for vehicular traffic. It's a road that has pedestrians. It has pedestrian infrastructure as well. It also carries power lines. It carries communication lines. It is also the conduit through which special kinds of events can sometimes be planned, so it can become a space where events take place as well. Now, what one ought to do is to give preference to projects that take all of those elements together and do what is called bundling of infrastructure. So it's not just a project for digging up the road and installing a fiber optic cable, but it's a project for improving the entire street in all of its aspects. So that the outcome is what we really focus on, which is a walkable, safe, well-lit street where the parking is taken care of properly and so on. Now, this was one of the important things that we tried to achieve in the Smart Cities mission, but many cities were not actually proposing projects for street redevelopment. However, now the Urban Challenge Fund can actually give a major thrust to the improvement of public spaces. So, these are just examples: housing, circularity projects, public spaces. These can be, given a preference under the Urban Challenge Fund.
So there are 2 or 3 things that follow from here, Jagan. One is that you need to have a very strong and connected leadership in cities for them to be able to understand what citizens want and what citizens need. That's one. It isn't always available in every city, as we know. The second thing is, of course, that this also means that you're looking at the city in its entirety as a startup, so to speak, where you get all kinds of investment. It's not just from the government, but private partners, corporate entities as well. So these 2 things are prerequisites, shall we say. We don't, as I said, always have this in cities. What do we do in such cases?
Well, I think what you've pointed out is the key problem, which is that actually leadership as well as dependability as a corporate entity, both of these are joined at the hip. If you don't have the right leadership, then the investor will not feel confident of investing in that city or in that particular project. So I would see this as essentially one problem, which is that we need to take care of the kinds of leadership that we need at city level. Now, one could do it, in a sort of executive order and say, well, all municipal commissioners must be fully in power or, and in charge of deciding on all aspects of urban infrastructure, which in principle they are, but they are not practically actually taking those decisions. Many of those decisions are taken at the state government level. So one could try and do that through an executive order, but that's not going to fix one of our key problems, which is that the municipal acts in the different states of the country, those municipal acts don't give the same kind of leadership model. So there has been, of course, a long-standing and very long-pending reform, which is called a Model Municipal Act, which should ideally be adopted across the country by different state governments. But because urban development is a state subject under the Indian Constitution, the central government will always hesitate to make it binding or compulsory, right? So that's one aspect, which is what can you do through executive action or through legal action. But the other is something which I think we now have a unique opportunity to do, which is to help the coordination between different agencies that are involved in the city, help that through e-governance. And when I say e-governance, it's not merely the creation of a website. It's actually a digitalization which has already taken place in almost all operations within the government, including attendance, marking attendance through a biometric in the morning. All of this is digital technology. If we can make all of these data available, let's say through a mechanism like a dashboard or a digital twin of the city, then the leadership can take better decisions. So one aspect is what we consider to be sort of decision paralysis that comes from too many different agencies, some at state level, some at city level, taking decisions about infrastructure and services. One is that aspect of it, but the other is Well, even if you did have a single leader, let's say, a mayor, an empowered mayor, how would the mayor have a full sense of the situation in the city? So that situation awareness and the complexity of the city needs to become more palpable to the decision maker. So all decisions in our cities are not delayed or inappropriate simply because there isn't a person who can take the decision. They're very often like that because there isn't sufficient knowledge about the problem, right? So reinforcing data gathering and the use of data analysis in decision making, using digital technology more to take decisions, this will be an important aspect as well. So it's a human plus technology kind of challenge.
And when you mentioned that, Jagan, it also brings to mind the kind of success that Swachh Bharat had in terms of the sort of cooperative or competitive federalism that we often talk about. But at the city level, it was like an urban challenge in a way. And we've seen some cities excel in that. Why have we not been able to replicate that sense of urban pride or urban sort of belongingness in our other missions or in our other sort of programs?
That's a great question. I think what Swachh Bharat Mission did was to create the awareness and also to create some level of local ownership for the solutions to the problem, right? And I think that's fundamental. Having said that, it's very unlikely that most citizens are aware about all of the problems that cities and city governments have to deal with, from transportation to water, sanitation, energy management to crowd management to housing, land use. All of this is very, very complex. So if Swachh Bharat is an example of behavior change at a societal scale, then we need that kind of behavior change at societal scale to be relevant for all of the different complex aspects of cities and how cities function. So I think we can create Jan Andolan, which is the term that the Prime Minister coined at the time of Swachh Bharat Mission. We can create that kind of Jan Andolan for fixing many city problems. Having said that, it is very difficult for us to build those narratives. And I'll tell you why, for instance, because there are entrenched behaviors that prevent us from thinking of the larger public good, right? It is often referred to as NIMBYism, not in my backyard. So the problem, if the problem's outside your house, how does that bother me? But the point is that the problem outside your house can very well occur outside my house as well. Right? If I remain complacent, that same problem will recur outside my house. But to make that behavior change happen, the government has to invest very heavily in creating the kind of awareness that, say, for instance, in the 70s and 80s was created through public service advertising. If you might recall, Doordarshan had these small spots called Zara Sochiye, which I still think is, in my childhood, one of the most influential behavior change communications that I've ever witnessed in our country, right? It just asked you the question, have you thought more about your behavior in the public, right? Now, I think we've lost track of that kind of communication work. We need to revive it in a big scale. And we used it a little bit in Swachh Bharat Mission, but we don't use it when it pertains to, for instance, road safety or something. The government relies on NGOs that have fairly shallow knowledge of the complexity of the problem for the messaging on road safety. But that's not right. It should be the government that takes the responsibility of communicating the right things at the right time to the right people, and not just farming this out or outsourcing it to the NGOs. And I think that's something which we have lost track of in our cities, because ultimately cities and city governments are built by people. Cities are about people, and the economic productivity of cities is reliant on its human resources. And unless those human resources are utilized properly and everybody actually contributes to joined, common goals, then we're not going to get the kind of economic productivity that we want out of our demographic dividend.
I was also thinking, Jagan, that could the Urban Challenge Fund also work in a way against this idea? Because if everything is about citizen awareness and private entities and public-private partnerships, the government role should also be kept in sight, right? So while they may contribute, say, just 25% of the funding to this fund, they must not lose sight of this broader aspect that you talked of, which is communication, or this idea of public service advertising. For instance, the kind of role that the government played during the polio program as well. That again was an attitudinal change, and a very successful one. So that it should not lose sight of that basic responsibility, right?
Not at all. I don't think that it can lose sight of it, because what we know is that the Challenge Fund is following one broad parameter, which is that only 25% of the funds will be provided by the central government. And the city is expected to come up with 50% funds through PPP, through public-private partnership, which means that the private sector will have a strong role in the implementation and the capitalization of these projects. Now, if the private sector has to be involved in this, then what it wants is a low-risk proposition, right? The city has to reduce the risk to the private sector. You see, the government sector always has been sort of able to rely on bailouts, from the government itself, from the sovereign funds. So there tends to be a sort of less stringency in terms of how the government uses its funds. But if it wants to attract that kind of volume of funding, which is to leverage, every rupee for 4 times, the amount put in by the central government, then it has to de-risk the environment in which these projects are delivered. Now, de-risking means not only what I mentioned earlier about the public behaving itself, so to speak, right? Or behaving in a responsible way with the infrastructure. That's a major part of the risk. But there are other risks. There are risks involved with relation to leadership, whether the leadership is in a position and is able to take the decisions that are binding over a longer period of time, right? So there cannot be any decision paralysis, there can't be policy paralysis also, or there can't be policy creep, right? So once you decide that you want to introduce a bus system in the city, it can't be that you do 10 buses and then you stop. And then suddenly the city sits and waits for the remaining 90 buses that it requires, right? So policy continuity, the decision-making powers have to be in place, reliability of decisions, the fact that if a decision is taken by the administrator in a PPP contract, then that contract will need to be revisited maybe 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, based on revenue models which are market-based, and there's fluctuation from tariffs might affect a particular project and its revenues. How do we make sure that that level of commitment is actually given not only by the city government but also the state government to which that city government is beholden? Now, you're absolutely right in asking that question. It's obviously not going to be enough for the public to be on board. The government has to play a very strong role in creating the right kind of enabling conditions for the private sector to invest in a sector which is largely perceived to be highly risky, especially because you need a revenue model to sustain the infrastructure and services, and that revenue will only flow if the project is designed right.
Jagan, while you were speaking, it also occurred to me that there was a model of development that Nandan Nilekani spoke of recently, where he talked about the individual private home becoming like an economic unit, which in a way, is responsible for its own energy. And he wasn't talking about gated communities. He was talking about the home, the flat or the home of the individual becoming like an economic unit and, in a sense, becoming self-sufficient or Atmanirbhar. Is that a model that the city can also sort of build upon, or will it ensure that people become less and less involved with the idea of, NIMBY, not in my backyard, that, you yourself are completely self-sufficient in your home, although that's still, I think, quite some time away. And then you don't really care what happens to the environment around you. But could it be a starting point, or could it be...
Well, I think it's a starting point for a particular line of thinking, right? Which is that every building block of the city, which is a house or a commercial building or a hospital or a school, every one of these is a building block, right? That's how you build the city, or that's how the economy of the city flourishes. Now, if every single block is self-sufficient to the extent that it can be, right, then of course overall it will lead to a cascading impact in terms of reduction of dependence on fossil fuels, say, in the case of energy, or it can lead to impacts in terms of the house itself being upgraded in technology so that it can become self-sufficient. All that can happen, but I have a feeling that this is a double-edged sword, precisely for the reason that you mentioned, which is that, in a sense, if I claim autonomy from the city, right? If I encourage autonomy from the city, then how do you build public goods like transportation, for instance? So what Mr. Nilekani seems to be saying is actually already playing out, is it not? Right? People are digging bore wells and sucking water out of the ground, even though constitutionally they're not supposed to. But because the city fails to provide them water supply, they all resort to their own devices. Likewise, most of our cities still have large areas which are not served by networks of sewerage systems, and therefore they just have soak pits and septic tanks. Now, take a septic tank, for instance. Sure, you can be autonomous, so to speak, right? You've got your own septic tank. But at some stage, that septic tank has to be emptied. Now, the truck that has to get to your house to empty that septic tank needs a road, which is a public road, right? Because you won't have every house being approached by an individual road, a private one. So there is, while we keep having these forays into these sort of dreamlike situations where we try and work around the public aspect of cities, there is no way to really do that. Because cities are fundamentally agglomerations of talent and skills and, a human resource. Those agglomerations only deliver economic goods if they work together in a synchronized way. Now, I don't mean to say together being everybody has to eat dinner together. No, that's not the utopia or the romance I'm talking about. I'm saying that there is a social contract. There is a civic contract that makes you responsible for what you do on the street, that makes you responsible for how you use public infrastructure. Now, I hope Mr. Nilekani is not suggesting that we do away with public infrastructure altogether. Well, at a certain size and scale, a small town of 5,000 city dwellers may be able to, take care of itself and not have to depend on anybody else. But even that seems to be far-fetched, because the moment that you put that town in a matrix of infrastructure that connects it to other towns, connects it to other resources, supply chains for food and supply chains for various other things, you will find that connectedness is the more important, condition that we need to address rather than isolation or autonomy.
Just to end the conversation, Jagan, what would your ideal city be if you were asked to do a pilot of the Urban Challenge Fund? Which 2 or 3 cities would you pick where you feel that it will be most successful?
Oh gosh, that's a loaded question. Where you feel that it will be most successful? I think that's impossible to tell. I'm not a soothsayer. Success is very difficult to predict. Having said that, the kind of cities that I would look at is one, I would take a metropolitan context. And of course, I am a Delhiwala, and I would say pick up Delhi and see if we can solve for Delhi. And then I would take a city in the hills, and I would take a city on the coast, or possibly on a riverside, because these are very, very specific and peculiar conditions. In the hills, of course, a city that I love is Darjeeling. I would pick Darjeeling and trying to solve for that. And on the coast or on the rivers, I think on the coast, I would certainly go for maybe Panjim or Vishakhapatnam, and along the river, I would go for a city like, let's look at Banaras. It's one of the oldest cities in the world. Can we fix Banaras using the Challenge Fund?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jagan. I think it was most insightful, and I do hope that all the ideas that we talked about today are developed more, and we contribute to developing these ideas as well at the Infravision Foundation under your leadership. Thank you so much, Jagan.
Thank you, Kaveri. And I hope lots of people read Vinayak's op-ed, because that has 7 very, very specific ideas for improving conditions in our cities through the Urban Challenge Fund. Close with that. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.